The morning air carried the faint scent of pine and lake water as I parked my old pickup truck beside the narrow gravel path that led to the cabin. The place had been quiet for so long, it almost felt like a dream coming back here. The cabin wasn't just a building, it was a relic of my family's history. My great grandfather had built it with his own hands nearly a century ago, and though time had weathered the wood and dulled the paint, its charm was untouched. The morning sun reflected off the still water of the lake, turning it into a sheet of liquid gold. I stepped out of the truck, stretched, and drew in a deep breath, savoring the peace I thought I had finally reclaimed. As I walked up the creaky steps, cooler in one hand and a duffel bag slung over my shoulder, I already felt the weekend stresses begin to melt away. I could almost hear the echo of my grandfather's voice telling me stories on this very porch, and the memory brought a smile to my face. I was sliding the key into the lock when I heard the crunch of hurried footsteps on the gravel behind me. At first, I assumed it was a neighbor out for a walk, or maybe a friendly passerby curious about my return. But the sharpness in the footsteps made me pause. When I turned, the sight that greeted me was anything but friendly. She came marching down the path like a general on a battlefield, sunglasses perched high on her nose, lips pursed so tightly they seemed drawn on with a ruler. In one hand, she clutched a clipboard stacked with papers, in the other a phone that looked ready to be whipped out at a moment's notice. She was dressed in press khakis, a floral blouse that screamed suburban chic, and sneakers that looked far too clean to have ever touched real dirt. Her whole posture radiated authority, the kind of authority no one had actually given her, but that she had claimed for herself. I didn't know her name yet, but every ounce of her demeanor told me she was the type of person people whispered about with a single word. Karen, excuse me, she barked, her voice sharp enough to send a few birds fluttering from the trees. What do you think you're doing here? I blinked, taken aback by the abruptness. Just unlocking my cabin, I replied casually, still trying to keep the morning peaceful. Been a while since I've been here, but I figured it was time to come back. Her sunglasses flashed in the sunlight as she tilted her head, scanning me like I was a trespasser caught in the act. Your cabin? She repeated with incredulity, dragging out the word as if it were some kind of crime. This is community property. This cabin is abandoned. You can't just come waltzing in here. I let out a soft chuckle, thinking she might be misinformed. No, ma'am. This cabin has been in my family for generations. I have the deed. It's mine. That was the wrong thing to say. Her mouth twisted into a tight smile, the kind that doesn't touch the eyes. Oh, you poor thing, she said in a tone dripping with condescension. You must be confused. I'm the head of the Homeowners Association, and as far as I'm aware, this structure is not registered with HOA, which means it falls under community oversight. And as head of the HOA, I have every right to remove unauthorized squatters. I set down my cooler and duffel bag, straightening to meet her gaze. I wasn't in the mood for a fight, but something in her tone made my patience wear thin. With all due respect, you don't have any right to tell me what I can or can't do on my own property. The deed is in my name. My family owns this land. Her nostrils flared, and she pressed the clipboard to her chest as if it were a shield. Sir, this is a private community. You can't just show up, break into cabins, and claim they're yours. Do you have any idea how dangerous that is? For all I know, you're some drifter who found an old key. I stared at her, trying to process the sheer audacity. Ma'am, I'm not breaking in. I have the original key, the deed, and every right to be here. Maybe you should slow down and listen before you start making accusations. But Karen wasn't interested in listening. She jabbed a finger toward the cabin like she was pointing out evidence in a courtroom. You're trespassing. This is against HOA rules, and you are in violation. I'll give you 5 minutes to gather your things and leave before I escalate this further. Something in me snapped at that moment. I had dealt with pushy people before, but never someone so brazenly wrong and yet so convinced of their own authority. I leaned against the porch railing, arms crossed, and gave her a calm but firm look. I'm not going anywhere. This cabin belongs to me, and I'm staying the weekend. You don't have the power to escalate anything." Her eyes widened, and for a second I thought she might explode on the spot. Instead, she reached for her phone like a gunslinger drawing a weapon. "That's it," she declared, her voice shaking with self-righteous fury. "I'm calling the sheriff. You can explain your lies to him. Let's see how confident you are when the law shows up." I shook my head, half amused and half annoyed. "Go ahead. Call them. I'd be happy to show them the paperwork." She faltered for just a moment, clearly not expecting me to stand my ground so easily, but her pride wouldn't let her back down. With a dramatic flourish, she tapped her phone screen, holding it close enough for me to hear the robotic voice of the dispatcher on the other end. As she launched into a frantic report about a suspicious man breaking into a community cabin, I leaned back against the porch and watched the lake shimmer in the sunlight, a strange sense of calm washing over me. By the time she hung up, she was practically glowing with satisfaction. "They'll be here shortly," she announced triumphantly, as though she had just won a major victory. "I suggest you pack your things before they arrive, unless you want to be arrested for trespassing." I gave her a slow smile, one that seemed to unnerve her. "Don't worry," I said softly. "I'll be right here when they come. And something tells me you're not going to like how this ends." For the first time, I saw a flicker of doubt in her eyes, but she quickly masked it with that same tight, smug expression. She stood rigid at the end of the path, clipboard clutched tightly, eyes darting from me to the road as if rehearsing the victory speech she would give when the sheriff arrived. I, on the other hand, leaned against the railing of my cabin porch, enjoying the view, knowing that the truth was on my side. The confrontation had just begun, but the real show was about to start. The wait for the sheriff wasn't long, though it felt like forever under Karen's hawk-like glare. She stood at the end of the path, phone still clutched in one hand, as though she was ready to call in backup reinforcements if the first didn't go her way. Every few minutes she muttered something under her breath, snippets like disrespectful, and "rules are rules" floated up the gravel lane. Meanwhile, I leaned on the porch railing, arms folded, content to let the lake breeze cool my temper. In a way, I was amused. Here I was on land my family had owned for nearly a century, being told I was a squatter. The irony was almost too rich. After about 15 minutes, the familiar crunch of tires on gravel echoed down the lane. A county sheriff's SUV rolled into view, sunlight glinting off its hood. Karen practically leapt into the road, waving her clipboard like a flag, positioning herself as the self-appointed guide to justice. The vehicle slowed, and when the door opened, out stepped Sheriff Daniels, a broad-shouldered man in his 50s with a steady presence and the kind of voice that could calm a barroom brawl with just a few words. "Morning, ma'am," he said politely as Karen rushed toward him. "What seems to be the problem?" "Sheriff, thank goodness you're here," she cried, pointing dramatically in my direction. "That man is trespassing on community property. He broke into this cabin, and he refuses to leave. I demand you remove him immediately." Sheriff Daniels lifted an eyebrow, his eyes flicking from her to me. He didn't rush, didn't react, he just listened. "All right," he said, evenly. "Why don't you both tell me what's going on?" "Sir." I stepped off the porch slowly, keeping my tone calm but firm. "Morning, Sheriff. My name's Jack. This cabin belonged to my grandfather, and before him my great-grandfather. It's been in my family for generations. I've got the deed right here if you'd like to see it." Karen let out a sharp laugh, shaking her head like I had just claimed to own the moon. "Don't believe him, Sheriff. He's just some drifter who probably found an old key. Everyone in this community knows this place has been abandoned for years. It's unregistered with the HOA, which means it's under our authority now. He has no right to be here." Sheriff Daniels held up a hand, signaling for her to calm down, then turned back to me. "You have documentation, you said?" "Yes, sir." I walked back to my duffel bag and pulled out a thick folder I had prepared before coming. Inside were deeds, survey maps, tax records, the entire paper trail of ownership stretching back nearly 100 years. I handed it to him carefully. "Every year, I've paid property taxes. The county assessor's office knows this land belongs to my family. The sheriff opened the folder and began flipping through the documents with a practiced eye. His brow furrowed slightly, not in suspicion but in recognition, as if he already knew what he was looking at. He took his time, scanning the signatures and seals, the maps outlining the property lines. Karen, meanwhile, hovered at his shoulder, tapping her foot impatiently. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "You don't need to go through all that paperwork. Look at him. He doesn't belong here. He's lying. The HOA would have told me if someone owned this land." The sheriff finally looked up, fixing Karen with a steady gaze that silenced her immediately. He closed the folder with deliberate care, then turned back to me. "Jack, I recognize this. I've seen these documents before, back when I was a deputy working with the county land office. Your great-grandfather bought up a huge portion of this county decades ago. According to these records, not only does this cabin belong to you," he paused, letting the words hang heavy in the air, "but so does nearly everything around it. As far as the law is concerned, you own the entire county." The silence that followed was deafening. Karen's jaw dropped, her face frozen in disbelief. She sputtered, trying to form words, but only managed incoherent fragments. That can't. No, that's not possible." "Oh, it's possible," I said calmly, though inside I was fighting a grin. "My great-grandfather was a shrewd man. He bought land cheap when no one saw value in it. Over the years, most of it stayed in the family trust. I just don't flaunt it. The cabin is mine, the land is mine, and by extension, the HOA you claim to run sits on my property." Karen's face turned a shade of red I didn't think was humanly possible. That's absurd. The HOA has jurisdiction. We have bylaws. We have authority." Sheriff Daniels gave a small shake of his head. "Ma'am, HOA rules don't override property deeds, and they certainly don't override county ownership records. If Jack here says this is his land, and the paperwork backs it up, then he's not trespassing. You're the one who's out of line." Karen's clipboard slipped in her hand, nearly tumbling to the ground. She looked at me with something between fury and fear, her voice trembling. "You can't just walk in and take over everything. You'll ruin the community. People depend on us to maintain order. Without the HOA, it'll be chaos." I took a step closer, keeping my tone even but firm. "I'm not here to ruin anything. I came to spend the weekend at my family's cabin, nothing more. But let's be clear, you don't get to bully me or anyone else into following rules you invented. The law is the law, and the law says this land belongs to me." The sheriff handed me back the folder and tipped his hat. "Jack, everything looks in order. If you have any more trouble, give me a call directly. Ma'am," he turned to Karen, his voice sharpening, "you might want to reconsider how you approach people in the future. False reports waste county resources. Don't let it happen again." Karen stood frozen, humiliated, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Then she spun on her heel, muttering something about taking us to the board, and stomped back down the path, her pristine sneakers kicking up dust clouds behind her. As the sheriff's SUV pulled away, I returned to the porch and sat down with a sigh of relief. The lake glimmered in the fading sunlight, and a sense of peace settled over me that I hadn't felt in years. The cabin was mine, the land was mine, and Karen's reign of petty tyranny had just ended. I poured myself a cup of coffee from my thermos, leaning back in the old rocking chair my grandfather built, and smiled. For the first time in a long while, the cabin felt alive again, not just a piece of history, but a place of belonging. And deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. Owning the whole county wasn't just a twist of fate, it was a responsibility. And I was ready for it.